Real talk is talk real cheap, and the rest is just squawk. Cheap, cheap. Two friends talk about everything they're trying to understand. Your friend with all these light bulbs be popping in our minds. Need to share our ideas with one another, time to talk cheap. Friends fully tripped because we all hella booked up in these lives. Saturday's the night when we get to riff and laugh, cause that's alright. Talk is cheap. Real talk is so cheap, cheap. It's so motherfucking cheap, 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 cheap. Can't be any cheaper unless it costs us something cheap, cheap. Because cheap, cheap is what it's gotta be. So cheap, other than some time spent, cause that's we're willing to spare. Cheap, 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 and that is all we got to share. We got 2 tickets to board these planes of reality. They know they just missed their train to Central. Hey, all aboard! It's a Saturday night train, so cheap. And real talk is cheaper than ever, ever, ever. Real talk is cheap. The real talk is cheap, cheap. Real talk is cheap. The real talk is cheap, cheap. Real talk is cheap, real cheap talk. It's real talk is so cheap. It's so fucking cheap, cheap. Ooh, real cheap, cheap. It's so cheap, 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 cheap. Can't be any cheaper unless it costs us something cheap, cheap. Because cheap, cheap is what it's gotta be. So cheap, 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 cheap. Can't be any cheaper unless it costs us something cheap, cheap. Because cheap, cheap, unless it costs us something cheap, 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 cheap. Can't be any cheaper. Real talk is cheap. The real talk is cheap, cheap. Real talk is so cheap. It's so fucking cheap, cheap. Woo! Real cheap, cheap. It's so cheap, 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 cheap. Can't be any cheaper unless it costs us something cheap, cheap. Because cheap, cheap is what it's gotta be. So cheap. Other than some time spent, cause that's we're willing to spare. Cheap, 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 and that is all we got to show. We got 2 tickets to board these planes of reality. They know they just missed that train to Central. Hey, all aboard! It's a Saturday night train, so cheap. The real talk is cheaper than ever, 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 ever. Real talk is cheap. The real talk is cheap, cheap, cheap. Real talk is cheap. The real talk is cheap, cheap. Real talk is cheap. The real talk is cheap, cheap, cheap. Real talk is cheap, real cheap talk is real talk is so cheap. It's so fucking cheap, cheap. Woo! Real cheap, cheap is so cheap, cheap, cheap.